This panel, Environment and Sustainability, it speaks to something you're going to hear a lot throughout this event, which is that we're kind of starting to take a more holistic approach to this. And about, one, it's what we're building, kind of the things that matter even from a city level to an individual level, kind of what are the new things that are being built and kind of what are the impacts of those on our world. But then also, what are we building those things from is kind of another key piece of this as well. So the things that we already do build, whether that's clothes or houses, right, we have kind of new approaches to the ways that those get constructed as well. So there's kind of two sides to this, and we're going to kind of represent those both here. So let's get started.
We asked those of you who registered for this to tell us what you're most curious about when you look at the future. And this is one of the responses that we got, which we thought was so perfect to be as the introduction to this panel. You want to read it?
Yeah, so...
You have better eyes.
Do I? I'm curious about the intersection of AI and creativity and how AI systems can be used to assist and augment human creativity. I'm also interested in seeing how AI can be applied to solve some of the world's biggest challenges, such as climate change, healthcare, and poverty, which I love. And this is something that I tell a lot of my students all the time, which is that part of the reason to be so excited about the future and to care so much about this is we don't really have the tools yet to solve these big problems, whether that's climate change or poverty or healthcare, or you could come up with a million other ones, but we just don't have the tools yet to really solve these problems. And obviously there are things that we can do now, but kind of looking to the future, there are these tools that are coming up and are going to mature, and they're going to kind of be the keys to making the change that we all want to see.
Right.
So
the tools and the mindset. And with that, we've got the perfect panelists to get us into the next thing. So I'm going to introduce very, very briefly Melodie Yashar and Ashley Gill, both of those women who are working at the forefront of their industries. One is in actual construction and building, and we love to describe Melodie and her title as a space architect, among many other things, which will describe the breadth of that job. And then Ashley Gill, who's working in regenerative textile and the industry around that. So with both of those, we'll just bring them on up and let them tell you more about their work. So thank you. Why don't you find that in? Y'all can take whatever. I know, we got the audio receipt. So Melodie, we're going to start with you. If you could just tell us, again, in this few minutes, right, a little bit about what you studied, what you're doing now, and where you think it's going, and then we'll let Ashley do the same.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Melodie. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I have an unconventional background for what it is that I do. The way that our CEO, Jason Ballard at Icon, likes to introduce me is that he realized I have both a background in architecture as well as human-computer interaction research. What our CEO, Jason Ballard, mentioned to me when he met me was, you're working at the intersection of architecture and human-computer interaction. I studied robotics at Carnegie Mellon, and he was like, man, do I have a job for you. What Icon is and what we do at Icon is 3D print large-scale cementitious buildings. We focus on single-family residential, but we also build buildings for the Department of Defense. We do resilient housing, affordable housing, homeless solutions. And so we're targeting a very, very wide market when it comes to how we're rethinking how to do construction from the ground up. So 3D printed buildings, what does that have to do with sustainability? Essentially, the construction industry itself is well known for being a huge contributor to carbon emissions worldwide. Even a single home using stick frame construction can lead to up to maybe 3 or 4 tons of construction waste. And that to us is not a sustainable future for resolving what we consider to be a global housing crisis. Over 1 billion people worldwide lack adequate shelter to housing. And so we're leveraging robotics as well as our proprietary materials and architecture, actually, to introduce a more sustainable and more economic solution to build faster and more affordable and dignified housing for the people that really need it most. So my background, yes, I work at the intersection of design and tech. That's the way that I really like to describe it. I didn't know I was going to end up where I am. I didn't have like the job title for what I do, space architect and VP of building performance, like didn't exist. It wasn't something that I looked up online. It was actually a very organic journey to how I got to Icon and sort of how these multiple fields that I was working in converged. I was a normal architect in New York for maybe 8 years, and it sucked. I was so miserable, and the coordination and documentation and just general day-to-day kind of tasks having to do with architectural production became kind of a soul-sucking thing. And also the work that we were, at least that I was like contributing to, just didn't have a lot of meaning, and it wasn't reaching people that I felt actually needed needed benefits in terms of like design and housing, and also just general well-being. So it was a little bit vapid. I made a hard shift in my career. I went back to graduate school, and that's when I studied human-computer interaction and robotics. After that, it led to a grant that I proposed with one of my professors at NASA Ames in California. And that went so well, I was given a full-time job offer. And I basically said, well, that's it. The rest of my career is going to be in aerospace. And I was thrilled, obviously. It was one of the best experiences of my entire life, being in an engineering environment, but not having a traditional engineering background. A few other things sort of transpired, one of them being that I was part of a university group that submitted and won multiple phases of NASA's 3D printed habitat challenge. From that challenge, which was actually just a volunteer-based opportunity, meaning we just did it on nights and weekends when we were all working full-time, we actually started to receive phone calls. People were interested in the work that we were doing. People were interested in the fact that we beat the European Space Agency, we beat Foster and Partners, like these big bureaucratic companies and organizations. And they were interested in us consulting for the work that they were doing in space architecture. So that was more or less the trajectory which led to how I designed space architecture for outer space. So we're talking about Moon and Mars habitats and thinking about space stations in lunar as well as Earth orbit. I had a mutual customer, myself and Icon had a mutual customer at the time, and that's how I was introduced to Jason Ballard and to Icon, and our worlds literally converged. He was like, how would you like to merge the work that you had previously done in architecture and construction with thinking about 3D printed habitats, not only for space, but also for Earth, for how we can bring value in the here and now, again, to the people that need it most. And so that's how my role was created. I was super lucky that he asked me to come on board. I had no idea what I was in for, and that was almost 2.5 years ago, and now I've developed a team of 16 people, and we deliver all of Icon's architectural and building projects. It's a great environment to be in. I'd love to tell you more about Icon, but yeah, that's a little bit about me, my background, and how I got to where I am.
I think actually one sentence on, or a minute on Icon, because I think Icon is fascinating, and I think people who aren't exposed at all to the world of thinking about 3D printing structures or homes or what that's about, and it's not just Icon, it's around the world. This technology is continuing to grow, but just your philosophy around it. Like, what does it mean? I mean, you're literally taking a machine, right? And you're like printing the structure. I mean, there's no drywall, there's no any of the traditional ways of building something, right?
Yeah, so essentially at Icon, we do large-scale 3D printing for buildings. So we have a large gantry-based robot. It's like 40 feet wide, and we basically deploy that robot on site at a construction slab, and it 3D prints a concrete building in record time. So actually, we finished a pavilion, which is going to be open to the public May 25th this month. You can actually drive by it. It's right in front of the Long Center. It's this huge stage that we've basically did it in kind to support some of the upcoming summer concerts and events that the Long Center is hosting. That structure, which will host 1,000 people, took 10 days to 3D print. And so it's record time compared to traditional construction. And because we're able to build more efficiently, only use as much material as we need, build faster, we also are able to introduce economies of scale. So another thing that we're doing right now is that we have, 7 3D printers deployed in Georgetown, Texas, which is a little bit north of here, and we're building a 100-home community there. You have to imagine, it's unlike any construction site you have ever seen. There are only 2 or 3 operators at each slab, and the homes get printed in roughly 2 weeks. So that will be the largest 3D printed community in the world. We're not aware of any other which is being attempted or that's even close to being completed. And those homes are going to be available for purchase actually in the next month. We're taking names down for reservations, and we're hoping that this is going to signal a new way to design and build homes in the future for everybody at every price point.
And what was cool, actually, the concept home you guys did, I think it was last year, also the rounded walls, right? There's a whole different way in which construction can look. So it's not even how you build it, but it's also what can be built when you're building with different kinds of materials and different ways of doing it. So there's so many cool and interesting things about your work and where you're going with that. There's like, Melodie also gave a TED Talk, I guess this past year, on what it will take to build housing or to build construction on Mars. So I totally encourage you guys to watch her TED Talk. Icon has a lot of videos online where you can see how they've actually 3D printed some of these buildings and these houses. So there's a lot where you can dig into more as you go with that. So we'll ask you more in a moment. You dying to ask Melodie a question? You guys?
I mean, I think you kind of covered it. I mean, I'm always interested in kind of when we have these new innovations that come out, like 3D printing a house, what are kind of some of the design considerations from the previous model, the previous way of doing things that almost kind of get carried over. Whereas so it's like when you're designing these houses or this 3D printed community, right? How much of it is you still have to kind of model it off of a traditional house just because it's what people are familiar with versus kind of when do you get the freedom to kind of go a little bit more out there and kind of use the capabilities of your tech? Have you kind of run into that balancing problem before?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially for customers and clients that we have, they can't imagine the possibilities of a 3D printed home. So what they want is essentially a house that looks exactly like a stick frame house would, right? Because there's just no paradigm to imagine what amorphous geometries or like curved walls might look like in production housing. It's just too expensive right now, and it's not feasible using the materials and means and methods that we have. The other thing that's interesting is that we 3D print the wall systems, but the house needs to be finished out traditionally. So your sink, your bathroom, your kitchen, even your roofing in many of our projects, like these are all things that we still rely on contractors to come in and finish out the homes. So there's a learning curve there. Sometimes they see the walls and they're like, well, what do we do with this? We've never seen something like this before. So we absolutely have to work to merge those two worlds, traditional means and methods with the new possibilities that we introduce with 3D printing.
And I think regulation becomes a part of that too, because that's the whole thing of making sure people feel like it's safe enough to be able to go do this stuff. All right, Ashley, talk to us about how your world intersects in some ways with this and where you're going, what you're building.
Yeah, I'm going to start out in a very different place. I actually grew up on a cotton farm in West Texas. My grandfather started farming in the 50s. My dad took over in the late 70s, and now my brother mostly runs the farm. And I grew up like working in the fields and wanting actually to, have a big fancy life and move completely away from the farm and not have anything to do with that. So I went to university and I studied history because I was just curious about it. I just really liked history, and so I studied that. Everybody was like, "Are you going to become a teacher?" And I, was like, "No, why would I become a teacher?" Which is actually probably something I should have considered, but. After that, I had this desire to to use, I think, what I had learned about my past with kind of the ability to help people. I really cared about communities and building up communities. I grew up in a small town, So that's really something that I cared about. So after college, mostly because I didn't want to get a conventional job, I joined the Peace Corps, and I moved to Cameroon in West Africa. And I was really excited because it was a big adventure. I was going to get away from Texas, and I landed on a cotton farm in Cameroon. They grew millet, they grew corn, but they also grew cotton. They were very impressed that I already knew how to pick cotton. But I ended up there, and I really saw this connection between the environment and people. And I grew up knowing that our family relied on things like weather patterns and rainfall and the health of the soil. But we are still kind of isolated or separated from it because we would grow peanuts and we would buy peanut butter at the grocery store. The farm that I lived on in Cameroon, they were subsistence farmers. And so everything that they grew was what they had to eat for that year. So they grew peanuts so that they could eat them. Their mind was blown that I didn't know how to make peanut butter, even though my father had grown peanuts. And so what that really taught me is this relationship between people and nature. And I was really fascinated by that and this idea that I could use my knowledge of farming to potentially impact people's lives. And so I had an idea that I wanted to do something with environmental work after I came home. And my mom, when I was living at home trying to figure out what I was going to do, found an ad in a local printed newspaper for an administrative assistant at a local, what they called a global nonprofit. And I was like, Mom, there is not a global nonprofit that works on environmental things in the panhandle of Texas. There's just not. But I was wrong about that. And in 2010, I started off as an administrative assistant for an organization called Organic Exchange. And they were built really around the idea of building up supply and demand for organic cotton at the time. And we were Organic Exchange for about 6 months. And then after that, we changed our name to become Textile Exchange. And we broadened our focus to be really on all the raw materials that end up in the apparel sector. Today, Textile Exchange, we're a team of about 130, the last that I counted, which has grown by 100 since I started a little over 12 years ago. I'm in my 7th job position at the same organization. So I moved from administrative assistant, I worked on communications for a little bit, and then the bulk of my career, I worked on our standards and certification, where essentially we would bring together stakeholders from every part of the supply chain and solve problems together. We solved problems like how to find sources of down that did not come from animal cruelty, how to build out more transparency in supply chains so that companies could understand where the materials were coming from, and how to build up more supply of raw materials that don't have negative impact on the environment. So things like organic cotton, we're now looking a lot at regenerative agriculture, practices that keep more nutrients in the soil, that encourage more crop diversity. And then throughout that time in the standards world, I slowly started to kind of expand my thinking outside of just the standards themselves and what kind of shifts are actually needed in the entire industry. So Textile Exchange, we have close to 850 members. If you think of a clothing company, they're probably members of Textile Exchange. We don't often hear our name kind of out in the world because we really work more with companies. But if you buy a garment and it says that it's made with recycled, or it's made with organic, or it's made with a material that has been verified against animal welfare, it's really likely that it came from a site that was certified to one of our standards. So the role that we play, I think, is a role, growing up on a farm and in a small town, I knew of jobs like being a lawyer, being a teacher, being a farmer, being a doctor. I had no idea all of the different jobs that existed. And if you told me that this job even existed and that I would actually be able to find my way here, I don't think I would have believed it. But as a chief strategy officer, the work that I do actually goes back to that question that those two questions that you posed before, of what does the world need from us and what are we best positioned to do And that's really my job at Textile Exchange, is I think about, in order for the textile industry, we're committed right now to driving a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the raw material production part of the supply chain, as well as other nature-related impacts like soil health, biodiversity, water, animal welfare, and human rights and livelihoods. And if we are going to achieve that, what does the industry actually need? What tools do they need? What data sets do they need? How can we make that information more accessible to them? And then what is the role that Textile Exchange plays? Because I think different from the work that Melodie does, Textile Exchange, even though we work in an industry that's very tactical and taking raw materials, turning them into clothing, we don't actually buy or sell anything. Our role is to influence the industry and to create change in one of the largest industries in the world that doesn't just cover agriculture, but it's also technology, it's also chemical production, dyeing and processing, transportation, shipping, design, product development, marketing and communications. And how do we kind of look at that whole system together and identify what changes need to happen to bring us to where we need to be? The textile supply chain is extremely detrimental to the environment. It relies on communities who are producing things like cotton, who are producing things like wool, and oftentimes it relies on those communities to their own detriment. Because over time they start to exploit the soil, they start to make short-term decisions rather than long-term decisions. And so a big part of the way that we see the future is that the industry has to transform itself. And that kind of, there's definitely technology that is going to help with that and is going to aid with that. We're not going to be able to do it unless we understand the impacts that are happening. And we have the technology to make all of that information transparent and available so that customers can hold companies accountable for their actions. But it's also about relating to humans on a one-to-one level and really learning to listen to those communities that are producing the fibers and learning to listen to suppliers that are caught in the middle of being asked to continually provide better and better environmental performance without additional cost. Returning back to them into their systems. And so we think a lot about change management and the relationships and the communities that need to be built within the industry to support it and to support that kind of growth of leadership and transformation over time. Because the textile industry, it's a hugely impactful one, but it's also a hugely influential one. And we really believe that if fashion can change and become a force for good, then the possibilities even beyond that could extend as well.
But it's always so fascinating, right, to see like what you studied, what you were curious about, and the zigzag that it got you to. Yeah. And then even in the same role, or the same organization, very different roles that you get to take. I mean, I think that's encouraging, roles. Right, that you don't stay static in some spot. Totally. What are you speaking about here at South by? You're doing a panel at South by, right?
Yeah, we're doing farm-level solutions to tackle the climate crisis. And I'll be talking about regenerative agriculture with Patagonia and then also with a Texas hemp farmer.
Oh, that's so cool. That's why I love it. So I think, again, what's so interesting is you realize the solutions actually do exist. It's trying to get the change, right? Yeah. It's like we can see that there's these little things. Right? This is what excites me about my job, is that you get to like point to the fact that there are these either solutions or understandings that if we could just get out there more broadly, we can actually have this huge impact that we want to have.
Yeah, and a big part, I think, of a challenge like that we're facing is actually the data and the measurement, because there are great production systems out there, but the industry will spend so much time arguing about the data instead of just like getting it done, that I think if we can use better systems to make that data more transparent, more democratic, there's less time spent arguing about that and more about just getting done what needs to happen.
Got it. All right, so you guys have questions for either Melodie or Ashley, and we can have them either online or and in the room. What are you guys curious about?
I could start it off, which is, I think young people, this kind of stuff comes naturally to the younger generation, and there's a greater value kind of placed on sustainability in the products that we buy. Yeah. So I guess my question to you is a bit of the present, the past, present, future kind of question, which was, How has this conversation around sustainable textiles changed kind of in your time working here? And then kind of what are the changes that you think are coming kind of looking forward?
Yeah, that's definitely something I've seen. Whenever we first started going out, or I should say when I first started, because the company had been around for about 8 years before I joined, but whenever I first started, we spent a lot of time just explaining why raw materials were important and why so many clothing companies don't know where their raw materials come from. And we spent a lot of time explaining why that was important and why they needed to be asking questions and to try to ask for materials that were better for the environment. And we don't sell sustainability anymore. We are responding to the industry coming to us. Because sustainability is not a trend. It's not something that companies are thinking about maybe getting into. They are now thinking about how do they transform it to become not just an activity, but something that's foundational to their business. And that shift has really happened in the last 10 years. And I think what I am hopeful for is that we're big believers that you can't solve problems if you don't have perspectives of everyone that's involved. We call it multi-stakeholder decision making, but really it just means that you are making decisions with multiple perspectives in mind. And the more people who are coming into this field, and the fact that young people are so passionate about this, and that it is just a part of the way that they see the world, it means that there are more minds coming in and solving these types of problems, and that's really exciting and hopeful for me.
It is. In the interest of time, we're going to have to release Melodie to go do. Are you doing a panel? Mm-hmm. What are you speaking on?
Excuse me. I'm speaking on robots for building in the wild.
There you go. Awesome.
Yeah.
Right? Exactly. Well, we should not keep you from that one, but thank you so much for being here. I would follow Melodie online. She posts a lot of stuff, at least on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Sometimes on Instagram, right?
Yeah.
On the things that you guys are building and working on. It's super fascinating to watch. So thank you so much for being here, and we really, really appreciate it. We'll spend a few more minutes with you, Ashley, if you guys have got questions, but we will let you go.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other questions we have for Ashley? JP.
I'm just curious, what is the low-hanging fruit right now as far as like what massive gains could happen in textiles very quickly that you see in the next 5 or 10 years that will be game changers?
So just to repeat the question for those who are watching online. So what is the low-hanging fruit, right? What is the impact that you could have quickly in a short period of time?
So Textile Exchange focuses on the raw material production part, and I think a big thing that will happen in the next probably 5 years is massive scaling of textile to textile recycling. Right now, if you look at where a lot of the recycled polyester specifically comes from, it comes from plastic bottles, which is in some instances is better than using fossil fuel, but actually it kind of just extends a linear life of the plastic bottle, because you can't today really recycle textiles. But that technology is happening, and we're really, I think, getting very close to a tipping point where the ability for companies to efficiently recycle textile to textile clothing, I think that's a big thing that's going to happen. I think the other really positive area, and I'm really focused on cotton and polyester because those are the massive, that's the massive volume of where most of our clothing comes from. But on the cotton side and other natural materials, there's a really big, significant increase in the interest in regenerative agriculture, which is very similar to essentially just what I'm talking about building resilience in the supply chain, things like cover crops, that type of thing. All of this, you mentioned before, all of the, the different technology and everything. And this idea of technology sometimes makes us think that like the future is going to be more on the tech side, but applying technology and applying that kind of thinking to very old ways of farming. Regenerative agriculture is not new. It's something that indigenous communities have practiced for hundreds of years. We actually abandoned some of those practices that worked really well, and I think we're starting to see more respect for that kind of farming, and also kind of a drive to use that to transform communities that are supplying the materials.
Can you imagine growing cotton in a vertical farm?
What do you mean a vertical farm?
Meaning like an indoor vertical farm, like not on the land, but like indoor. In indoor farming. Are they thinking about textile?
I don't know about if there's anyone that's currently working on that. I mean, part of what we're like, yeah, someone in this room maybe will be the one to,
Or online, yeah, exactly.
to think about that. No, I mean, really part of what we are focused on is taking the communities that are growing the fibers and figuring out transformations that will benefit them. And if you think about moving away from, like, I mean, one of the things we're talking about in this panel is what does it look like for agriculture to become more resilient in the US? And a big thing that happens is that the way that farming has advanced, where there's a lot more reliance on chemicals, there's a lot more reliance on inputs, a lot of times what that means is that farmers are paying more and more to farm, and they're getting less out of it. And so if you think about, we're really interested in what we call a just transition. And so finding ways to change farming that really benefit the active producers involved and the farming communities in Texas and California and Pakistan and Africa. So that's more on the side that we're kind of on, and less on the tech, like, kind of transformation side.
I'm just curious if that's possible.
Yeah.
All right, one last question, Z, and then we.
Well, does anyone else, or do we have one from Zoom?
Nancy? Nothing. Both of you quickly.
Go.
I was going to ask, what do you think is the role of, I guess, governments in these countries to help sustain and support this kind of farming?
Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just for the Zoom people, we need to make
Yes,
sure that we
thank
repeat
you.
it.
Thank you.
And it's what is the role of governments around the world, and kind of what role do they play in this conversation?
Yeah, really, really great question. It's of something that is changing. There's a lot of policy happening in the EU that's not really about production. It's about how companies source their materials and whether it's actually okay for a brand to keep sourcing from places that they don't know where it's from, they don't know what's actually happening. And so there's an interesting dynamic of these countries where the majority of the brands and retailers are in the US and Europe. We've already, decades ago, put in practices that protect farmers, that protect workers, and a lot of our materials are coming from places that don't have that legislation in place. And so I think governments have a huge role to play in this gap between kind of the lowest common denominator and some of these top performers. So legislation is not going to bring everybody to the level of, say, a Patagonia. They're not going to be able to do that because Patagonia is a really unique company. But if they can raise the minimum playing field, and then you continue to have innovators, you continue to have people who are thinking really far ahead to inspire and innovate in that direction, but you need legislation to keep the minimum threshold from being in a place that actively harms communities and environments. It's a great question.
Awesome. Thank you. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
You can find us on textileexchange.org. We also have a really active Instagram account, and the mastermind behind our Instagram account is in the back of the room. But yeah, Instagram I think is a great place to follow us, or our website. Yeah.
Great. And do you personally post about stuff that you're passionate about?
I'm really bad at social media, and I don't post as often. Usually I just reshare things that the Textile Exchange shares.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us,
Yeah,
Ashley. I
thanks
really,
for
really
inviting me.
appreciate it.
It was
Thank you
great.
guys for being here.